really quite an honor and pleasure to meet all of you. I know it is difficult. I can't imagine just finishing your class and popping onto the computer like this. I'm deeply grateful, and I think that it'll be worth your time. So I'm going to just jump right into to getting my PPT on. How do I do that? Oh, there it is. And um, and and I'll basically be asking you up front to think about ways in which you might be able to implement some of these exercises in your various classes. So I know that there are some of you who work in the grammar school as well as secondary and college. And at the end of this presentation, I'll talk about the Newman Prize for English Jueju. And this year we will open a UK prize. And so before the end, you'll know all about how your students can enter their Jueju poems into this competition. The goal for me, for you, that is what I hope you will get out of this is you won't feel intimidated. You'll feel like you'll be able to teach this form of poetry in any level of your teaching. You'll have an idea of what the goals and outcomes will be. You'll have an idea about how to do it yourself, how to write an English Jueju. And you'll know how to point your students and their families to the education resources online so that they can participate in this spring's Jeju competition. For me, my hope and goal will be to get feedback from you, especially for those of you who work in the grammar school, as this is not my area, not my wheelhouse, and we've had the most success in what in the US we call elementary and middle school, kindergarten through year 7. But high school has also been quite popular as well as college. But I've been really surprised by the success for the younger students. So I'll be interested to see how we can improve upon those successes as we bring Jueju into the English language. All right, so without further ado, let me try to go ahead and introduce these. As Philippa said, please do write your questions in the chat, and we will make sure that all of these are answered in a timely way. If it's an urgent question, just flag Philippa if I don't answer it right away, and we can come back around and do, respond to that question before the end of the presentation. So the name of this presentation is How. Right, how do you write English Jueju? But also why write English Jueju? So these are two of the question or the answers or responses, I think, to the question, why should we write classical Chinese poetry in English? And the first is that English or early success with Chinese poetry composing, right, even if it's in English, can help a beginning Chinese language student build a deeper commitment to Chinese earlier on in their journey. Okay, so as I mentioned, as we were chatting before my talk, if you want to teach Chinese Jueju composition, you usually will have to start in an advanced intermediate or early advanced level student, so at least year 3, before they probably have a lot of the linguistic aptitude to compose Jueju or Lu Shi in Chinese. But the problem is that poetry is a great hook for introducing young people to Chinese culture and language. So we don't want to wait for 3 years or 4 years before we introduce these higher level skills. So I'm advocating for using a student's native language, in this case English, as a first step in delivering a more meaningful engagement with Chinese culture and allowing students to develop a sense of pride and accomplishment early on in the Chinese learning process. So the goal of the Jueju is to give a student a relatively simple task, which is to write and follow rules, poetry rules, but at the end, give them a product they feel a lot of pride in. So a low bar for difficulty and a high yield for success is our goal for younger learners. The students, I believe, learn through experience, through hands-on direct experience, ideally. We can talk to our students about Chinese poetry, about Li Bai and Du Fu and Tang Shi and Jin Ti Shi and Gu Ti Shi and Ge Lu Shi Xue, all of these things, but we're only talking about them, right? And they will always remain distant to the English speaker. But when one learns to write one of these forms for herself or himself, like language itself, it becomes more, one learns how to express oneself through poetry, right? So I know this from teaching creative writing in English. I teach, for 15 years, I was an English professor, and I taught both modern and contemporary world poetry, American poetry, but also I, I taught creative writing. And in the creative writing class, always students wanted to write their own poetry, but they rarely wanted to read other people's poetry, right? And so it's much, young people in particular are more interested in self-expression than learning about, work from the past. And so ideally you can do both, introduce older poems at the same time as teaching them how to write themselves. By combining the two, you incentivize them to take history seriously, to engage the literature and the culture seriously, but it gives them that incentive of self-expression. And I believe this is important for language learning and cultural learning more generally. So hands-on learning. So we're going to start by just introducing what is Jueju. I think most people here are already familiar with the form, but a Jueju is a form of Jinqi Shi, which is a Tang or Sui period, but Tang is when it became a popular genre of Gulu Shi or regulated verse. Jueju is the most popular form of classical Chinese poetry, even if the longer 8-line poem, the Wu Yan Shi and Qi Yan Shi, they were perhaps more revered in history, but the Jueju is the most popular because it's short, easy, one can write them for various events that one might be attending, share them, and they can do a lot of heavy lifting. They can express grief, loss, homesickness. They can express very serious sentiment in a very short, punchy way. But a Jueju is a poem of 4 lines, and each line will have either 5 or 7 monosyllable words each. And so we'll talk about syllables a lot later. So this is the genre of Jueju, the most popular classical Chinese poetic form. Looks like this slide got a little messy, but the question is why teaching Jueju in English translation is not enough. So let's take a moment to look at this first couplet from, this is from a Wu Yan Shi by Li Bai, right? 青山横背锅，白水绕东城, right? When we look at the poem in Chinese, we can see its structure, we can hear its sonic pattern of tones and rhyme. But when we transfer it into English, it becomes quite a different object, quite a different material condition. So here is a famous early translation: where blue hills cross the northern sky, beyond that moat which girds the town, 'twas here, da 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 da. This is very Victorian style. In the 20th century, we'll get a shorter style, less Victorian, but it's still much longer than the original Chinese, with a blue line of mountains north of the wall and east of the city, a white curve of water, here you must, and so on. In other words, translation can help a student understand the content of the poem, the story that the poem is telling, but it does miss the form of the poem. And my argument to you today is that for students, it's not the content that's the most important. It is actually the form, that the form teaches wisdom, that the form teaches a kind of ethical or moral idea of the universe. The form helps us understand balance and harmony. The form itself is so beautiful and so inviting that we lose so much when we move to English. So I started to experiment with, well, how can you use English to capture the form? And so here we have, again, my spacing on the slide is a little bit, got a little funny here, but it should be one syllable to each one. 客是青青柳色新, guest in green green willow sheen. Okay, the first experiment shows that English and Chinese have a strange similarity. English has a lot of monosyllables, and the tones, because we don't use tones in English, you could add Chinese tones to the English and reproduce the same sound. 客是青青柳色新, guest in green green willow sheen. It is possible, although statistically it isn't likely to find that many translations that follow this. So here's an example of the most famous 绝句 by Li Bai. And I'll talk about how we can use a new system to translate it and then to teach it. Okay, so I'll go ahead. I like to do the 吟诗吟诵 as opposed to 朗诵 for 绝句. So I'll try this one real quick. 船前的明月光，疑是地上霜。举头望明月，低头思故乡。Moonlight fall near bed, as if frost there spread. Lift gaze, find bright moon. Miss home, hang my head. When we use monosyllables to translate the Chinese, we're able to reproduce the same meter and rhyme as the original. One technique is to add the Chinese tones to the English vowel to show the student where the original tones fall when spoken in modern Mandarin. Right, so 床前明月光, moonlight fall near bed. So I used to do this for about 10 years or 15 years, but I have a new system I'll introduce to you later on in the lecture today. All right, so translation is possible. It is possible to show a student what the poem means and how it sounds. So we get, I think, within the range of translation, we have a number of tools to help our students understand Chinese poetry, but I would argue that these tools are still insufficient. So one of the things, that we might want to do is to teach our students how to write 绝句. So this is one of my own 绝句. I just wrote this one like a month or two ago. But the problem with composing 绝句in Chinese is that for someone like myself, a non-native Chinese speaker, it is very much a prosthetic exercise. A prosthetic is when you have like a fake arm. Imagine touching something with your plastic arm. I can't quite feel. I don't know if it's good or not, right? I don't have a total connection to the poetic quality of the language. I can follow rules and I hope to write a good 绝句 and I can get the advice of others, but it does feel very difficult. And that's for me, someone who studies poetry quite a bit, it's still not easy. So I'm going to talk about at the end of my lecture today some new exercises to help teach Chinese in the 绝句, but I'm going to focus instead on English 绝句. Okay, so what exactly is English 绝句? I don't know about the UK, but I'll be interested to hear from you all whether or not British students know what haiku is, the Japanese poetic form haiku. Almost 100% of Americans know what haiku is by the time they graduate from secondary school. And many, if not most of them, have written one, right? But almost 0% of them will know what a 绝句 is. And of course, none of them will know how to compose one. So one of the goals of my project over the last 20 years is to introduce the 绝句, just like the haiku, into the pantheon, into the canon of English forms, like the sonnet, like the limerick, right? I want the English 绝句 to be a common English form, just like haiku, because until the English language has absorbed the form, we really have almost no ability to communicate deep Chinese poetic values into the English language or into the students of English-speaking countries. So the goal here is to introduce this. So Mag says that haiku is a part of the curriculum in Scotland, and I expect that it is likely that most schools in the UK introduce this form because it's quite easy. It turns out Jueju is also quite easy. There are more rules than haiku, but it is no more difficult. All right. So here's what I'm hoping. Right? Students from English Jueju will learn key concepts and terms from classical Chinese culture. Students will learn to weigh and measure and think about the nature of words, how they sound, what they mean, and how they can relate to one another in a balanced way. They'll also learn how to compose their thoughts according to Taoist, Confucian, and Buddhist insights, right? The Sanjiao, the three systems of Chinese philosophy, religious spirituality, and morality. So here's an example of the terms that my students learn from the English Jueju exercise. They'll learn the concept of yin and yang, of pingze, the two tones categories. They'll learn about heping, about harmony, about Dao, Wen Dao, right? How to make literature follow the Dao. Duilian, how to compose and what parallelism is in Chinese, Duizhang, why it's important. This is also linked to Wuxing, or the five element theory. They'll learn about the Qing and Jing, about the feeling and natural scenery, and they'll learn that classical thematic progression of Chinese composition, qi, cheng, zhuan, and yuanhe. I'll give you a couple of examples of how. So in Wen Dao, you can tell a student all about Wen Dao, right? You can kind of explain the concept to them. But when they themselves must compose a poem that follows Wen Dao, when they believe, I have taken words and I've shaped them into the order of the Tao, I would argue this is a much deeper connection to the concept of the Tao and the concept of literature in the Tao than you could ever get from a vocabulary test, right? A term like Li Yi, what is poetic about a poem is also something you can explain, but when a student does it, when they understand how Jing and Qing work together in a Chinese poem, when they do it themselves with their own hands, this, I believe, is a far superior method of teaching than explaining things to them as if they lived far, far away and long, long ago. So how do you teach in English Jueju? Right? So the answer is you master the rules, you master the form. And so I teach Jueju as a game. I'm sorry, I went ahead. All right, so I have a number of handouts that are on the English Jueju website. And these are the ones that, of course, I'm always looking for feedback from teachers about how to make these handouts better. But you already do have access to these. I've also shared them with Philippa, and you can get them from the website that I'll show you later, or from her. But the handouts include game boards and game pieces. These are little word sheets that you can cut out and give to your students if you have a classroom. If you're online, then it's obviously different, so that you wouldn't be able to use manipulatives, but you could cut them out yourself when you're giving the class presentation and doing breakout sessions with them and so on. There's also online resources like a rhyming dictionary that is, I think, essential for this form of poetry, and learning videos. Here's an example of the game board and game pieces some of my students were using, right? So you cut out word pieces and a blank board, and they are able to move the pieces around the board until they can successfully build a poem. By doing this, we remove some of the difficulty early on in understanding how the poem works. And then they can move away from the pieces and write their own words in. But it's a kind of step-by-step process. All right, so using the tools, again, there are game boards that include a scramble board, which is an already complete poem. You cut them up and you give those words to a student and they can rearrange them on a blank board, right? This is a much easier exercise. I call those scramble boards. Or you can just give them a blank board and tell them the rules and they can come up with things themselves. Animated videos that the students have available to them may be, depending on your area. If you're in secondary school, I think they're appropriate, but if you are in the grammar school, they're probably too advanced still, although the parents or teachers might be able to use them well. Philippa, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there and just clarify for you. So grammar schools in England are secondary schools, and they're usually for sort of students have to pass an exam usually to get to the grammar school. So they're definitely students that are used to quite a challenge.
Yeah, so all right, so what I mean here is the elementary school level, so from first year school to fifth or sixth. So from the age, say 5 to 10. I think that these videos will be too advanced for those students, but for the older students, that I think they are quite useful. And one of the things I'd like to do is build videos for the younger students. This I look forward to your feedback on. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the prize, and then we'll go into the poem examples before we do our breakout session and come back for discussion. So the Newman Prize for English Jueju was about 10 years old now, and I've been teaching English Jueju since 1997. But the prize is really the way that I'm trying to introduce the poem as a complete system to the wider range of participants. And in the past, we've limited the competition to the state of Oklahoma. So Oklahoma, I think, is a great target state because it's not rich in Chinese cultural heritage, although there is an interesting connection to early Chinese inhabitants of the West. But nonetheless, it's not New York and it's not California. So people don't expect Oklahoma students to be excellent at writing Jueju, but they have in the last 10 years become quite excellent. And so this is just a small map of poems that have come from different schools, many of them quite rural. And the teachers that use the system to teach the Jueju in Oklahoma often write me emails, with their own feedback. And many suggested that they really like the Jueju exercises because the students with limited literacy, that is, they're not great writers, they actually can be quite great Jueju writers because Jueju has such complete, total rule system. So the student can learn the rules and be successful. They don't have to be particularly gifted at writing, and they don't have to like poetry to do it. I often compare Jueju to Sudoku, to the math puzzles, because I think it challenges a part of our brain quite different from the self-expression poetry of free verse that people usually think about poetry as. So let's take a couple moments to look at some examples of Jueju in English. So this one I wrote in Yunnan, maybe, 12 years ago. I was at on a hike, and I sat down and I looked up, and in Yunnan the trees have very long moss that grows on the limbs, and so this is a Jueju about that. Gray moss, thin hair, soft breeze blows, white blooms, green stems, clear stream flows. Close eyes, hang head, am I here? Raise head, look up, no one knows. So I'll talk about why this is a Guti Jueju, an old style poem, a little later. But the short answer is that this poem does not use parallelism, right, 对仗, and it doesn't use the Pingzi system. So it doesn't have all of the rules that many of the other 鲁诗 or regulated Jueju have. But there's still quite a few rules that it has to follow, and we'll look at those in a moment. All right, here is an example of a jueju with parallel meaning. And I'm going to take a moment and show you how that works. So this is a wujue. Dark waves, harsh wind blows, night swells, strong storm grows, soft breath, weak chest falls, death's grief slams, then slows. This poem also happens to be mine. It was a COVID-19 inspiration, as you might tell. All right, but this one has parallelism in it that actually exists in the Wuyan Shi and Qian Shi forms. This is the 8-line form, but I wanted to introduce the concept to English jueju. So jueju does not use this rule, but the 8-line version does use the rule in classical Chinese poems. It's quite important to poetry culture, so I introduced this artificially into the English jueju. And what you'll notice is that the first 2 poems are parallel, dark night, right? And the next one is not parallel, but has some feeling of difference, almost opposite. Wave, swell, breath, harsh, strong, weak, wind, storm, chest, and blows, grows, falls. But if you take these as units, you can feel very strong parallelism and anti-parallelism, right? Dark waves, night swells, soft breath, harsh wind, storm, strong storm, weak chest, right? Because these are, chest is a kind of lungs, right? So wind and storm and lungs are all about breathing air and so on, blows, grows, falls. All right, and then the final line is not parallel, right? So this is the a system derived from the Wuyan Shi and Qian Shi, Jinqi Shi tradition, and it is parallelism. So it teaches students balance of meaning. The next one, this one uses Pingze theory. So this one is actually regulating the poem based on the sound of the words, the yin and yang of vowels. The student just finished this one this fall. Stones lurch, waves twirl, sea salt sprays, fish jig, boat drifts, cliff line sways, cold hands, wet cheeks, warm bones ache, ice hard, tears stream, all thought strays. I'll give you the next one just to show you how that works. This one, I'll talk about it more here in a moment, but this one follows the Ping. I'm familiar with this. Again, I'll talk about it in a moment, but the students have actually followed the same tone patterns as the classical Chinese poems must for this form. And this is one of the great, I think, discoveries of my work, is that English and Chinese share so many linguistic characteristics that we can use the Chinese patterns to teach people in English how to do these very complex forms. So I'm going to skip over this and I'm going to come back to it later when I introduce this concept in a moment. All right, so let's talk about just those basic rules before you get to the Pingze and the parallelism. Number 1, we only use monosyllabic words, and we try to avoid particles like the, of, a, because particles are unstressed, and as such they disrupt the classical Chinese rhythm. So classical Chinese poetry is a monosyllabic poetic foot. That means that the stress unit is the word, and it must be one syllable. Unlike Putonghua that we speak today, which is polysyllabic, like daxue, right? This is a kind of 2-syllable word. In Wenyan, in classical Chinese, most words, especially in Tangshi, are monosyllable. So the form of the poem has to have a monosyllable foot in a single word. And it turns out English has at least 4,000 or 5,000 good monosyllable words, which means we have a huge variety of words to choose from to write this kind of poetry in English. All right, that's number 1, right, is only monosyllabic words. Number 2, we pair our image words into groups of 2 or 3. So the first one, as you see here, is white stones. Right? White stones go together, but stones and cold, not so much. Right? So white stones groups together. Cold stream flows, those group together. White stones, soft breeze, cold stream flows. So the trick to writing Jueju in English is the same as it is in writing Chinese. You want to pair your words into clusters of 2 or 3 characters, right? And they should stick together naturally. That produces the beautiful rhythm of a classical Chinese poem like 传心 pause, 明月光, right? Or we could sing it, 传千的明月光. That pause is quite important, and that's produced grammatically. In front of the bed, 传千, right? Then 明月光. Okay. Rule 3, and I think all of you will like this rule because it's one of the most important ideas of the Keju, right? Of the Baguwen in particular, which of course has a very bad reputation in the 20th century. But Baguwen is very important to Chinese culture, and Jueju follows the same basic pattern. It's also in Wuyanshi, Qiyanshi, the other poetry forms, and the Baguwen, which happened later in the Ming and Qing dynasty, of course, was modeled on this, on the poetry form. And I think it works much better for poetry than it does for Wenzhang, for essays. But let's look at it. So the first line of a Jueju will introduce scenery of the natural world. The second line, Cheng, will deepen and extend that natural world. Often it will focus in on. Third, Zhuan, the poem often to a human emotion or feeling. And Yuanhe will conclude the poem and unify the external world and the internal world into one world, one complete experience. I believe that there's quite a lot of wisdom in this progression, and it helps students become mindful of the relationship of inner and outer, mindful of words and how they work, mindful of how they sound, mindful of what they mean. And it helps people focus, I think, on a very calming, introspective, and yet social way of thinking about language. So these 4 rules, I think, which are essential to Jueju and essential to Chinese culture, are most naturally at home in the Jueju. Okay, those are the basic form rules for the Guti Shi, for the old style Jueju, the level 1, the easier. I didn't mention the rhyme scheme, which has to be A, A, B, A. I'll add that to my slide later. It must have dropped out. But let's talk about briefly these more advanced rules like parallelism. And so I'm going to take a moment here, although I want to stress this. It will take you probably a little longer to learn these rules. So we're not going to do these poems probably in our breakout session. You can do it if you want, but I'm going to focus on the level 1 Jueju today for our own exercise. It takes a little practice to get the level 2, the parallelism, but I want to talk about it since I have you here. So when you're writing a parallel poem like this, it's important for the students to know that they're probably not writing like this, but they're writing a little bit in both directions at the same time. In other words, when you come up with a line like dark night, dim stars, fresh fog drifts, that gives us a line of nature, right? We also have to think immediately, well, what would be parallel to dark, to night, to dim, to stars, to fresh fog, right? And the students can think about the words that are sort of synonyms or similar, parallel to one another, right? And so they're actually writing vertically and horizontally at the same time. And in that sense, it is very much like a crossword puzzle. It's a little bit more like a Sudoku than it is a simple poem. but it shows in this form. It helps us understand how and why classical Chinese philosophy believes so much in yin and yang, and in the Wuxing idea of five-element theory, that the whole world can be harmonized. And in Dao, Wen Dao, the literature that follows the Dao, we, the poet, are able to harmonize language, to bring ourselves into harmony with the Tao through acts like Dui Lian or Dui Zhang, through parallelism. We're able to shape language so it's not chaotic, but instead moves in the yin and yang. We have one, we must balance it with another. Okay, and so I like this exercise because I can introduce very deep concepts of Chinese culture into the poem process. Now, the most difficult to get your head around right now, but it's actually the easiest to do, is the Chinese tone system for the Jueju. And I didn't think that the young students could do this, but last year in the Jueju competition, the winner of 5th grade, so what would that be? He was about 10 years old, had a perfect example, and he won with a beautiful example of Pingze. And so it is possible for young people to do it, even though I didn't expect them to. So Ping and Zi are important parts of Jeju culture, of poetry culture. They date back to the Sui dynasty, when the Chinese poem or Chinese tones were first discovered by the poet Shen Yue. And Shen Yue, he discovered that the 4 tones differentiate sounds, but that they could be balanced. And so a poem with a first tone and a second tone would be ping, and a word with a third tone or fourth tone would be zi. Now in the Middle Chinese, we also have ru sheng, the entering tone, which I'll mention in a moment. But what these allowed Chinese poets to do was to then balance the sound of language so that the word, I'll shift to my next slide to show you. So a word, if we look at this, this is a zi here, and this is a ping. This is yin, right? Oops, sorry, I guess I don't need to, right? A yin here and a yang here. And they will be balanced. If it's yang here, it's going to be yin here. If it's yang here, it'll be yin here, yang here. And they will be creating this parallelism of balance in the sound of the poem, right? And so these are all going to be related to one another in these couplets. And so these patterns, this is pattern number 1, balances tones based on whether it's a yin tone, right, which is a zi, or a yang tone, which is a ping. And so it's quite important for classical Chinese culture to understand how and why the Keju system, right, the imperial examination system, required every leader of China, right, every important person for 1,500 years learned these skills, right? This was incredibly important to believe, I think, in the Chinese Empire's knowledge system, is to believe that a leader must be able to harmonize their own language, to bring their language into the Tao, if they're going to harmonize social relationships in the family or in the town or in the city, the province, the nation, right? So the Confucian values, I think, that undergird the Keju are very clearly understandable inside the Jueju form. So we can show our students and talk about the relationship between beauty, moral cultivation, self-cultivation, and language. But if you can show them how to do it and they can learn how to do it well within an hour or two, then they have their own practice that they can tie these lessons to. And they aren't abstract 1,000 years ago in a foreign country. Instead, they're local, they're individual, they're personal. And so that's the goal here. These are all examples of students who have followed these these systems. So I'm going to spend just one more minute here to explain how English breaks into these two tones. But please don't be discouraged by this portion of my lecture today, because the Pingzi is a little difficult to understand in the beginning. And I have handouts for you, and you can get them online as well, that can lay out these rules in a slow, methodical way. And the students, so far for me, have not had any trouble learning these rules. So don't be intimidated by them at first. So the basic idea is that inside monosyllable English and monosyllable Chinese, there's a rule. The rule is called allophonic lengthening in linguistics. But what it means is that if a word ends in a voiced consonant, right? 浊的声母, this is kind of consonant that has a 浊 sound. It's a vibrated sound like need. It will make the vowel quite long. If you end it with a unvoiced consonant, niet, it will be quite short. Okay, so in Chinese, in Middle Chinese, you could end a word with a P, a K, a T. And just like English, these will be quite short. And so the ru sheng is a very short, quick vowel, whereas the ping sheng is a very long vowel, right? So if you have no consonant at all, like ni, that's also long. Niet will be short. So we can call this long and short, or we can call it full and clipped. This is the clipped sound, because it's basically a shortening that happens. Sorry. Okay. Let me make this an L clearer. Very good about that. Okay, but full or clipped sounds. So sky is long, right? Flaw, who, because all of these have no consonant at the end. Bay, but if you put a T here, like bait, it's short. Bay is long. Lab, long. But if you had lat, it would be short. Lab, dad, lag, jazz, rave, lathe, age, all long. Lap, tat, tack, lass, laugh, latch, path, all short. Okay, so it doesn't have to do with which vowel it is, the A vowel. That's not important. It's what follows the A vowel. That is the part that will determine it. So the students, all they have to do in order to do this form of poetry is simply look at the end of the word and ask the question, is it voiced or not? And they can have a list of the letters and check them off. And actually, it's quite simple. It doesn't take any kind of genius to do this. You just have to follow the pattern, which, if you're interested in, we can talk about later. So I introduced this level only last year for the first time, and it was quite successful. And so I believe this is the deepest version of the exercise I currently have. And so we're going to move now into the breakout session, but we're only going to be working in the first level. We're not having to do parallelism in your breakout session. But I want you to think about what words could go into the blanks here. And so I've added a couple words for you to work with, but also left some blanks. And so if we wanted to put something in front of trees, we would probably want to do an adjective here, right? And then if this is another noun here, we'd want to put an adjective here. But you can put two nouns together. You can put a noun and a verb, right? Or an adverb, and so on. So you don't have to do adjective, noun, adjective, noun. You can do whatever you want. In this case, we have a verb and a preposition. Okay, but what is important is that your words should be monosyllables, and that they should develop the proper theme as we go. And so we're going to take 10 minutes and have our breakout sessions. Just think about what words would go here to make a beautiful poem, and then we'll compare your answers and the full session and talk about the challenges and opportunities of writing Jueju in English. I hope this was helpful, and that you can start to see the depth of lessons that we can teach about Chinese culture, history, politics, aesthetics, philosophy, all of these things, direct hands-on experience through a deep, um, personal, intuitive, self-expressive manner with our young students or our older students or adults. It doesn't really matter. They already have English, and this is simple English. The rules are Chinese, but the language is English, and the language itself with monosyllables are quite simple even for young children. But the rules can introduce the deeper concepts. And so that's why I personally believe that our first step to teaching classical deep Chinese culture could and probably should be done in the English language first, and then after they've gained these rules, they can apply it to their simple Chinese. But to start with Chinese would be quite difficult. Although in the Q&A, I'll talk about our next project and how I hope to add Chinese to it. But let's go ahead and, Philippa, if we can start the breakout session into groups of 4 or 5. What do we have here? We have 12. So let's do groups of 3, actually.
I was going to suggest we've got 5 groups of 3 ready to go.
Awesome. Well, let's do that, and I'll pop in and check in on you guys as we go. Okay, well, I'm, of course, interested to see what poems you guys created, and then to have a general discussion for the remainder of our session together so that I can get your feedback and also give you tips about how to successfully teach the Jueju to your students. And I'm hoping that all of you will see the benefit in introducing the competition to your students. So I can answer questions about the competition as well. But let's start first with your Jueju. So I guess the best way to do this would just be to have you volunteer and then put your Jueju into the chat.
So maybe whoever was in group 1, if somebody from that group wants to volunteer, and obviously if you didn't finish the whole Jeju, don't worry, just tell us what you have initially. That would be fantastic. So somebody from group 1 first.
Sorry, shall we just say it? It's quicker.
Go for it, Jane.
Yeah,
let's say that yes, we say that is how our poem is: tall trees, white snow, cool breeze blows, and the next one it is low hills, golden moon, slow brook flows, and then breathe in new hope, warm. I think we say warm big hug. And then breathe out, hard time, soft heart grows. That's what, if you get it. That is.
Yes, that's great. All right, well, there's only one word that has to be changed, and that is no big deal because you use the word golden, but you can use the word gold, and gold can be an adjective without the en at the end, and then it will be one syllable. So congratulations, all monosyllables. Very good progression of theme. The first 2 lines give us a very rich atmosphere of nature. And then your 3rd line produces an unambiguous turn toward human emotion. And your 4th line very clearly gives a resolution to the relationship between the external scene of snow and the movement, I think, probably from winter toward spring, right? From the hard times toward the better times or human companionship and love. So I feel like this poem is good. I would definitely be happy if my students turn this in for their first time. So that's great. Philippa.
I just wanted to add as well as a sort of an aside, a sort of maybe a teacher's view of an aside to that, aside from the poetic aesthetic of what that group created. I also like the fact whenever I went in the group, you were all giggling and having fun and enjoying it and enjoying the mental challenge. So just sort of thinking about that related to your classroom as well, I thought was nice. Sorry to interrupt.
That's awesome.
Slightly on a tangent.
I noticed that too when I popped in. And you guys, you have a lot of parallelism in here. So it wouldn't take very much for you to move your level 1 gu ti shi into a jin ti shi with a little more parallelism. You already have a lot going on, and because you really foreground the warm and the cool, you have a yin and yang dynamic already in your poem. So, you know, if you were all, if we were in a class together, I would be encouraging you to potentially translate your poem to level 2. So that's really great. Thank you for breaking the ice too, and getting us introduced and with fun, like Filippo said, which is essential. How about group 2?
So I think, I'm not sure, but I think Carol and Wei, you might have been in group 2. If one of you two wants to tell us what you came up with.
We just finished half. Is that okay?
Of course, yeah.
Bold trees, dry leaves, cool breeze blows, cold moon, bright sea, soft stream flows. That's it.
Was it Bright C SEA?
Yes, that's my creation because we think it's bright light, or I can't remember. We discussed it at the end, so I put C instead.
Ah, here we are. I'm gonna open it up in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, so bold trees, dried leaves, cool breeze blows, cold moon, bright sea, soft stream flows. I hope everybody can just hear. If you don't have an ear at first for monosyllabic English, I believe you, because all of you are familiar with Tang Shi and you've memorized many Tang poems probably as well, you can hear the strange relationship between English and Chinese. It really, to my ear, is incredibly beautiful. Bold trees, dry leaves, cold breeze blows, right? It has, anyway, it's a very lovely choices, I think. In this poem, if you were to complete it, you know, that breathe in, breathe out kind of forces you to think about the internal state and then how you resolve that internal state. And so I think for you guys, because you have the ocean here, you have a lot of choices in your nature scenery to, you know, to bring. But I think bold trees probably foreshadows human resilience of some kind. So I imagine you might think about how a human being can be, you know, bending like a tree, you know, even in this kind of relationship to the ocean and so on. So there's much to think about for your next 2, but I think it's a great beginning. All right, Mac, for group 3, we have, do you want to read it?
Hi there. Yeah, for group 3, we have big tree, small stream, cool breeze blows, warm sun, blue sky, quiet river flows. Breathe in fresh air, touch May dew. Breathe out, ooh ah, fair face grows.
Okay, interesting. All right, so let's go
So
over
there's a
this
bit
one.
of Scottishness in this one.
I love it. You know, I've been working in last year to develop a Scots version of this because Scots is the only other language besides English in the world with enough monosyllables. So if you want, you can contact me later and I can share my students' Scots. They are not very good. No one knows them, but Scots mathematically, it is a language that we could use for this exercise. So anyway, I love that touch. Let's look at it real quick. Big trees, small stream, cool breeze blows. Okay, so this one seems perfectly situated to get us into nature. Warm sun, blue sky. Now here are the two words we have to change, quiet and river, but we can do that by saying something like calm instead of quiet and stream instead of river. But we have stream up here, so we could use another word like or there could be a Scots word for a small stream that's one syllable long. I don't know the Scots, so I can't say. But you can find another word besides river that would be one syllable. Flows. Breathe in fresh air. Touch may do. It is extraordinary. I love that. You know, it's so fresh actually to touch may do. It just makes me incredibly happy when I see that. Breathe out. Ooh, ah, fair face grows. No problem. You know, I think actually to use vocables like this, it's not normal, but I don't see any reason why not to if that's your style. It doesn't violate the rules of monosyllables. So I hope everyone can see that this, you know, this one gives us a very, very different world than the first one or than the one that the second group was building. I'm trying to see Scott's word, weir. Yeah, of course. This is a great word for it. The W-E-I-R. Oh, I love it. Okay, let's go ahead and do group 4.
I typed in, I made up the second one, so myself, I just typed it.
Okay, so you want to read it out loud?
Well, let's try. It was new trees, young branches, cool breeze blows, brown leaves, dry bloom, shallow stream flows. Breathe in fresh kiss, new life rise. Breathe out past words, old thoughts throws. I change throws to grow. Sorry, I change growth to throws. You can read.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I'm looking at it here and everyone can follow along with us. So it's wonderful. And do you have any? Does anyone have a? Can anyone catch the 2-syllable word in the first line? And it's kind of funny with right. We have that one is in the second line. Good, branches, right. So all we have to do here is simply make it singular. You know, take off the plural and you're fine. New trees, a young branch. You know, it's not quite the same feeling as branches because I know in a tree you have it, but twigs, juncai, great. So this is the thing about English monosyllables. We have in the English language before the Renaissance, there were so many monosyllable English words, but then people started to introduce archaic French, Greek, and Latin words into the English language, and we end up with the language we have today. But in Middle English, you know, you have in Old English, you have many of these ancient monosyllable words. So the history of English is similar to the history of Chinese. It starts with a huge number of monosyllable words and then moves toward a polysyllabic language later on in its life. But the beauty is that there's so many, 4, 5, 6, there's even 8,000, but let's say there's 4 or 5 really good poetry words. You can usually find an answer. If you want to indicate an idea, but you don't have a monosyllable word, just keep looking. You'll find it eventually. So twigs is an example of that. It's really good. Philippa, limbs, yes, of course. Right, so 2. That's great. Mag, I went to University of Edinburgh for my master's degree, and I would hike Arthur's Seat every couple weeks, and even wrote Jueju on Arthur's Seat actually. So it's I love that connection. All right. this is why, I think I had chosen clear stream, because if you can see the bottom of the stream, right, it would be shallow. But in Scotland, you might have something, that could be affected by the peat, that gives the water a tint. So, one just has to think very deeply about what you want to see in your poem. I'll take this moment just to tell a quick story. When I guess it was before COVID, so it was summer before last, I brought a group of retired Oklahoma alumni. So these are people in their 60s and 70s, 80s years old, and we traveled through Scotland and England, and we had a Jeju tour of the UK. And every morning I had them have a notebook, and we would go to the famous location, maybe in Wales or Snowdonia or something like that, and a beautiful location. And I'd have them write down all of the monosyllable words that they can see, smell, touch, feel, or hear. And then not to write the poem, just to capture the language around them. Then when we returned to the bus, they would write their Jeju and compose them with the actual material in their world that they saw. And then over the last year, they kind of write to me an email about how those Jeju froze their experience, really captured those moments in time like crystals, and they never melt. And I love this idea that the Jeju, when I do it with my students, we really do walk outside and close our eyes and think and try to gather the monosyllable words around us. That idea is, I think, really helpful if you have the opportunity to do something like that, to really help them become mindful and let the poem writing be a meditation, not only on nature, but also on their own emotions and their internal journey. So don't fear. The beautiful thing about poetry, and this is why it's so important, I think, to language learning, is that it's a spiritual, deep personal connection. And the more authentic and genuine you can be, the more the student will risk their own vulnerability and give you something really meaningful to them. And if they do that, then they're bringing Chinese very close to their heart. And this is my goal, which is to make Chinese not far away, not something different from them, but something close to them in their own streams, meadows, cities, in their own block, in their own home, in their own mind and heart, right? And the more that you can link the Chinese learner to the Chinese culture, right, I believe the closer their identity will be to become a long-term Chinese speaker. So I think we don't need, I want English teachers to teach this too, but I think it has a unique purpose for Chinese teachers. So that's great. With regard to Philippa's point about about winter break, this is because the resources are already online, because the competition window is January and February. It makes it a perfect timing for this. So outdoor learning, sustainability, Mags pointed out about environmentalism, for instance, I think is very true. There's so many lessons inside the wisdom tradition of Jeju. The lesson I feel is very easy to communicate, Mag, on this point is the difference between Qing and Jing, right? That Chinese poetry doesn't use personification. So they don't typically, poems won't very often give human traits to natural things. They also typically don't use simile or metaphor, a little bit, but not very much. So those are really common English tropes. So the Qing and Jing is about how to use nature to reflect emotion and how to see nature through emotion, right? And that they're not separate from one another. They're actually connected. The human being and the natural world are one thing, not two things. And so I think the message, the spiritual message of almost every Jeju is inside the form itself. And I feel like it's deeply ecological in its worldview. So Carol, I'll come back to your Chinese version in one moment. Zhengming, you have right. Well, that's up to you, Mag, about the alcohol. My older students didn't mind having some wine when they were doing their Jeju. Zhengming, in the past, from Oklahoma, the average final entries that are counted, so these are not the false entries or wrong entries somehow, or inappropriately admitted, like the students have to send them through their teacher or parent, for instance, as 350 poems from the state of Oklahoma usually are the ones that are in the final judging. I'm hoping that the UK will have an equal number or more. So if you have one student, or sorry, one classroom doing it, and you have 30 students, or you teach 5 periods of 30 students like this, then one teacher can bring in well over 100 entries. The teachers also get recognized in the ceremony when their students win. In the past, that means the teacher gets to come to the award ceremony with the famous Chinese writer. So I'll talk about that as we get to the end here. I'll talk about the competition a little more. Okay, well, let's go back to Carol real quick, and then we'll finish up by talking about the practical things about the competition itself. So Carol's poem, if everyone can take a look up here, you can see how her poem is a direct match to the English. And this is what I hope to bring you for 2023. So I'm working right now with a Chinese linguist colleague of mine who works in the Duiwei Hanyu Xue to produce a bilingual version of this exercise. But I can tell you how to do it right now in a way that I wish I could give it to you in a finished form, but it's just not finished yet. But this is the idea, is that you create the poem either in Chinese or English first, or ideally you work in both languages until they're very nearly perfectly mapped to one another. But if you have this, gushu, the sort of old trees, right, ganye, dried leaves, when you hand the word piles, right, the little pieces of paper with the words for the students to arrange, on one side can be English, on the other side can be the Chinese word, the vocabulary word, right? And so they can either write it in English, put down the English words into the correct order, or they can flip it and put the Chinese words into the correct order, again, pairing them into adjectives and nouns, like gushu or ganye, right? So this, I think, is a very easy way to kind of map a little bit of Chinese exercise onto the English Jueju. I wanted to try to express to all of you how and why doing this only in English, even without Chinese, will still have a lot of benefits to your Chinese students, because they're going to feel an immediate personal connection to the Jueju form. And then once that becomes strong, then as their Chinese gets better, they will feel more adventurous to write their own Chinese Jueju. I worry about putting the Chinese on this because I don't want them to think of the Jueju as foreign, as something that they can't feel through their own heart. I want them to feel very personally connected to the Jueju, and then they're connecting their heart to the deep Chinese culture. From that connection, we build higher level cognitive abilities. But I believe that starting with the English for the UK and American students, Australian students, New Zealand, so on, those native English students, they're just lucky. We're very lucky in the English language to be able to write Jueju like this. One cannot do it in Italian or in Spanish because there's too many syllables. Even German inflection makes it very ugly. But in English, there's a magical relationship between our two languages that allow us to do these poems in English. Okay, are there any questions before I pivot over to just kind of give the wrap up about the competition? Yeah, Philippa.
I just wanted to say, well, first of all, Kwa, I think we'll be sending you the materials. That was your question about sending the English Jeju Teachers Toolbox. Just really to say to all of you teachers who are here today, thank you so much, and thank you for staying. We've overrun a little bit, but I think it's been incredibly useful and interesting, and definitely something very different for you to bring into your classrooms. And what I would say as well is that once you get going with this in your classrooms, it would be really helpful for both myself and Jonathan to hear how you've approached it, what the impact was on your students, and all of those kind of things, so that it can help both of us improve on the material
Yes, I
created.
very, very much want to hear more feedback, but I do realize that the time is.
And also, if you have any questions after this session, because it's a lot to take in and you might want to go and think about it and all those kind of things, you know, you can always send me through questions and I can forward them on for you. So don't worry, you have time to think as well.
I'm looking forward.
Sorry, Jonathan, should we just wrap up with some details, as you said, about the competition? I think people are having to go now. School takers are coming around and saying you have to leave and things like that.
Right. I'm just going to put up Philippa, you will be sharing this toolbox that I sent you. It has Word file, like Word tokens that you can give to the students to write the Jeju with. It has a detailed how-to manual for both styles, and it has a flyer which can be used for the competition. Basically, I will open the window now, and it will stay open until the end of February. There is an email that you'll email the entries to with your name on it. You know, the teacher's name, the student's name, the contact information. And if they win, they get not only $500, but they'll also get a certificate signed by the president of the University of Oklahoma, myself, and they'll be a part of a ceremony where we will honor Yan Liangke, the famous Chinese author who won the Newman Prize for Chinese Literature. So all of this will happen on the first Friday of March. So the last week of February is the closing of the competition, and so your students will have a few months to play around with the form to get hopefully a good entry, and then you can submit it to me through that email.
Okay, so yeah, I just posted in the chat just to let everybody know. We'll also post these details on our website, on the CI website. We'll also post them in the eForum, so you should have all of those details available. And hopefully you and your students will have great fun in creating some beautiful poetry and refining them as well, and making them as lovely as possible. And obviously, if they end up winning, not only do they win this prize, but they will have the kudos of being the very first UK entry winner for this competition. So
that's true.
Big kudos for your students.
Eternal fame and glory.
And their names will be alongside some very, very, very famous Chinese writers.
That's right. A true
history.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you for hanging around a little extra there too. I appreciate that very much. And do feel free to reach out. I mean, you are all teachers. I'm a teacher, so I don't mind it in any way having personal correspondence with any teacher. So Philippa, if anyone requests my email, feel free to give it. And thank you guys. I really do look forward to hearing your feedback and seeing your students' work.
And thank you so much as well, Professor Sally, for giving your time and sharing these brilliant new ideas. As I'm sure you can see in the chat, everybody's saying, thank you. It's great. I think at a time of during this year when teachers have been really struggling, it's been really nice to have something really inspirational at the end of this term to get your teeth into with your students. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, I hope to see all of you in person one day before too long. And until then, we have poetry.